So I'm here with Jean Dunn from our congregation of St. Andrews, and because it's National Indigenous Awareness Day, we are talking about some of her personal experiences with Indigenous peoples up in the far north, because her son and his wife moved up there in 1999, supposedly for 2 years, on a teaching contract, and now it's 2020 and they're still there. So they've obviously fallen in love with the land and with the people and are very happy there. And Jean and Ted, her husband, have had a wonderful opportunity many times to go up and visit them and experience it. So we're going to talk a little bit about their culture and their lifestyle out there. And so start by telling me a little bit about the people and what their lifestyles were like.
All right. The government made them, since they were nomads, and went to follow the caribou. In 1950, the government insisted that they go into the inlets, and so they can be counted, and they had to learn English, and it wanted them to do English ways, or our ways. So they, for the first 20 years, it was very hard for them, and there were a lot of people that were ill, and it was very difficult for them. So anyway, then after that, in 1960, in the late 1950s, they started the schools, and they wanted the children to do English. They insisted that they had to keep their Inuit way, the Inuit language, which they did. And in the 1960s, the Anglican Church came in and had one school there, a one-room school, and they taught them. Some of them went to school, some of them didn't, and so for the first 20 years, first generation, it was very difficult.
But they did half in Inuit and half in English.
That was after the Anglicans left, and it was they had that, they insisted that they wanted that. Yes.
So they stood up for themselves rather than like some of the cultures we've heard about. They get sent to the residential schools and they lose all their culture and their own language and everything. But they said, no, we're not going to do that. And they maintained their language,
Well, then in the 70s, they had their own Baker Lake Day School, and they had people came up and taught. Then new schools were built just before in the 70s, and there's the school, the junior school and the senior school. Very beautiful schools.
Yeah, tell me this story. You told me about this woman named Winnie.
Okay.
Tell me about Winnie.
Winnie Wichita. It was a teacher and she was in the 60s, and so she was grade 9 and 10, she became a school helper, and then she went on for quite a few years that way, and they finally got her to go out and get her education, and she has become one of the mainstays of education for young people. So she actually
became a teacher.
She did,
and has been there ever since.
And she's just retiring this year, and so she's retired as a teacher for 35 years.
I bet she inspired a lot of students.
She did, and they really admire her.
Yeah.
Yes, and for the first while, there were very few students went out to get an education after grade 10 or 11. Now that they have the high school, they have a big grand graduation. Sometimes it's only 6 or 8, sometimes it's 12. But Rebecca was mentioning that after her first 10 years, took 10 years, there were 3 or 4 of them came back to help or work in the community. One of them into the gold mine. She was going to be working something in the gold mine, the science line. Another one came back as a social worker, and another one came back as a teacher's assistant. So therefore, when the students saw that, then they decided it was time to do more. And so now there's about 50 to 70% of them that go out and get education and then come back.
And then come back to help the community. And that's where their roots are, but they come back and they've learned different things and they're able to help their own people.
Well, the one good thing is, because the government sends out all these legal papers, a lot of the people have no idea what the jargon is in the legal papers.
Oh, yeah.
And so a lot of the younger people can read them, understand them, and dispute them.
Oh, yeah.
if they want to.
Really good.
So they're standing up for themselves.
Yeah, and they also, you've told me how they've also stood up for themselves about the land. The government wanted them to divide the land and own the land. And,
Yes.
And
They wanted it so that each person had their own house on their own land. Then they buy it. But they said no. They, as a whole community, 24 territories voted no. That the land was not theirs really. It belonged to everybody. And anybody that lived up there.
And they wanted to continue holding it in common rather than letting individuals own the land.
That's right,
Yeah.
because then it could be sold to the government, or the government could buy it.
And that seems to be a really an important value to them, like the value of community and in common. And you were telling me as well about the potluck suppers, like the caribou hunt and how they share the meals together.
Yes, and they have usually a festival time, which they did when we were there, and they got together and they'd have games, and then they had their square dancing, which was wow, it was really something. and they're very musical, and then they have bring all these big iron pots in where they each had a caribou, and they've made the stew, and everybody eats. And elders go first.
Big feast.
So Ted and I got up there to go first. It was really something.
Yeah.
Yes, and then they have the. You were mentioning about they're very, very friendly people. Very quiet, and they sometimes, as Bob was mentioning, that it would take a while to get to really know them. But then once you knew them, you were friends for life.
So they welcomed you in as outsiders.
It was really, really wonderful because they don't really have all that many people of the families of the people that come up to work there. The families don't come very often.
Okay.
So we've been up 5 times, and so they it was really cute.
Yes. Tell me about this doll that you've brought back from one of your visits.
Yeah, actually Rebecca sent it to me. So that they make these are the dolls that the girls have, and of course they're all made with all their own material and
fur and seal skin.
I put it in the summertime. It goes in the freezer because it would fall apart. I think because none of it's tanned.
Because they're used to the cold weather.
Right. It's just the same with the mittens, the rabbit mittens that we'll maybe see a picture of. Yes.
Yeah. So what else? Like they're rooted in the past in these traditions and this traditional way of life, and still hunting the caribou and still making things. You've told me they use every part of the meat, the bones, the skin. They use every part of it. The antlers, it all gets used up. So they're living a very traditional life, and yet they have Wi-Fi and technology, and they have people getting educated and learning new ways of doing things. How do you think they kind of find the balance? Like, what's the?
Well, I think as long as the community is there, and the people are there, then you will have your traditional ways. Now they have Inuit days. They have a week that they do from school, and they go out. Everybody learns to make an igloo.
Oh, yeah.
That is for survival, because you never know when your skidoo might quit, and you have to look after yourself. So that's one of the things they learn. Games, certain games that they play, and then also the skills, different skills, and a lot of it's running.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So they stay in good shape.
Good shape, right? And they have their, arm wrestling and all that. You see, and so they stay very skilled in their ways. Yes, and it's wonderful to see. We had the dog races on the lake, and that was really good. Right outside, and the lake, of course, is 8 feet of ice, and they're hoping by the end of this month that it will be thawed and they get water so they can travel on canoe and boat. up the lake.
Really living off the land.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. We've. I hope everyone feels that they've learned a little something, and you know, sometimes we don't know what other people are like, but you've had the experience of meeting them and living with them, and I think really learned that deep down that we all share a lot of things in common.
Well,
you know,
this is it.
and it's all about being in community and how do we love our neighbor, right?
And the thing is that their biggest thing is their security for housing and their security for food, because in Baffin Island the caribou have a disease and they're pretty well gone now.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So you cannot get caribou.
Yeah.
So you have to depend on the fish.
Yeah.
And they only take one fish at a time. They do not take.
They don't stock up.
No.
Yeah.
You don't do that unless you're. It's a season, end of a season where you're going to have dried fish, and then that's for your winter stock.
Yeah. So very simple way of life, but
yes,
I think
you don't take any more than you need.
Communal way of life.
Yes, and they're very, very gentle people. They don't want a fire because and their trees are about I would say 6 inches high. There was Ian took us out to show us a tree.
And that's about it.
That's about it. Yes,
Yeah.
and he said it was about 15, 20 years old. So it was,
wow.
and no, the winds kill them. So no, it's very. You think you look for miles. You think there's nothing there, but the peat holds all their medicinal ones. The plants, they have blueberries. Barberry that's red, and that's your nutrition for the winter. And you put that in your bannock, and you have that. That's your, and some of the ones are for teas for the winter. They dry them for teas, and there's a mushroom that's for burns and sores and that. So they live off the land, and now it's hard for them to comprehend all this going out. Rebecca has a class she had for quite a few years, took 2 or 4 students out every year for 2 weeks to be outside of they went from on the East Coast, they went to Alberta, some to Saskatchewan, all over the place, and they stayed with families there, and I think there were 2 that came to Bayfield and one summer. And they learned to broaden their views, and but it's the young people, and it's that are going to be the ones that set the stipulations of how they want their land. And their neighbor, Mama Lack, she is 25, and she's in the federal government, and she was voted in last fall, and she's their neighbor, I think about 3 doors down from Bob and Rebecca and Baker Lake. So.
Well, and I think it's good because they have a voice. It sounds like they have a strong voice. They're not being told what to do.
No.
They say, no, this is who we are, and this is what works for us.
And they all work together.
Yeah.
It's a very quiet, serene place, and if you ever needed anything, there's something on your doorstep. They share.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about this.
Okay.
All right. Now I'm just going to sit here. I'll show the doll. Yeah, that's great. Okay. That's a wrap.